John Lott joins us now. He's the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, and he follows the data closely. John, good to have you back with us, sir.
It's great to have you back too, Vince.
It's great to be here. So what do we make of this, John? All of these headlines tell me that I don't have to be worried at all.
Well, there are real problems with the FBI data that's occurred over the last few years that we haven't seen in the past. There are two measures that we have of crime. We have the FBI counting the number of reported crimes to police, and then we have something called the National Crime Victimization Survey, which surveys 240,000 people each year in order to get an idea of what total crime is, what reported and unreported crime is. And there have been, prior to 2020, these two sets of numbers generally tended to go up and down fairly closely with each other. But since then, they've been going in opposite directions. And in 2022, for example, while the FBI showed a 2% drop in violent crime, the National Crime Victimization data showed a 42% increase in violent crime. And even if you just use the FBI data, it's very clear that law enforcement in this country has collapsed. You look at the arrest rates for the 5 years before COVID for the largest cities over 1 million in population, though this is true across the board. For the largest cities, they had an average arrest rate for violent crimes of 44%. It started falling in 2020. And by 2022, it was down to 20%. That's an over 50% drop in arrests. There was an even larger drop in property crimes. And look, people can go to your CVS and you see there or the Walgreens and they see a lot of things behind glass. And they have to go and call up a worker there to go and open it up and stand next to them while they try to read the packages and decide which one they're going to get of something. They know that wasn't true a few years ago. It's not that these companies are doing it just because, they think it's fun to spend the extra money on this type of stuff. They're doing it because otherwise you'd have real theft. And another way of looking at this is that if you look at arrests relative to all crimes, reported and unreported in these cities, only 8% of violent crimes result in arrest. And only 1% of property crimes result in arrest. And not all arrests result in charges, let alone prosecutions or convictions. But so we have two things here, though. We have reported FBI data going in the opposite direction of our measure of total crime. And people have long known that most crimes aren't reported to police. Only about 42% of violent crimes are reported, only about 32% of property crimes. But it's even worse than that because the FBI measure of reported crime has been going in the opposite directions of the National Crime Victimization data of reported crimes. And that's something we've never seen before. They're what we would say perfectly negatively correlated since 2020. When one goes up, the other goes down.
So the crime victimization data is up since 2020? Is that right?
It's much higher now in our latest numbers for 2022 than it was in 2019. It went down slightly in 2020, and then it went up in both 2021 and 2022 by a dramatic amount.
Okay, so that's people reporting that they've been victimized by crime, but the actual,
that's right.
but the arrest data is going down according to the FBI's tracking. So. You mentioned a number of factors that have led to that. One of them, as I understand it, is that you have major American cities who aren't even reporting their data to the FBI now.
Yeah, that's one thing. In 2022, for example, you had about 31% of cities that didn't report their data. We don't have the latest numbers yet for 2023, and obviously the numbers for 2024 coming out, there's still going to be a significant number of places. Now, the FBI just doesn't put down zeros in it. They kind of guess what they think the numbers are. But I would argue that they've been doing a pretty poor job, at least what we've been able to look at so far in doing it. But I think there's another factor that's going on there, and that is as arrest rates have plummeted, people are less likely to go and report crimes. that are occurring. Whether people think the criminals are going to be caught and punished has some effect on at least some people's decisions whether or not to go and report crimes to the police. If why report a property crime, for example, if you think there's virtually no chance of doing it? And this also gets into why the two measures of reported crimes, not just reported crimes and total crimes, but the two measures of reported crimes are going in opposite directions. So, in the past, if you called up 911, they'd send a police car out. But now they're going to ask you, well, is it an emergency? Is the criminal right there, right now? And in many jurisdictions in the country, if you say, well, no, the criminal's left, they'll say, well, you can come down to the police station and go and fill out a report. But, we have to warn you, it's unlikely much is going to happen to them. And so what happens is that you've made it more costly, more difficult for people to report crime. And so some people are going to say, it's just not worth my time to have to go down there and do the reporting. And so what's happened is, I think one of the reasons for the differences in the two measures of reported crimes is that some people just don't understand that simply calling up 911 doesn't put the crime on the reported list.
There's another piece.
You have to have a police report filled out.
There's another piece here about 911 calls that you're making me think about. There's a gentleman on Twitter, on X, called Dave Statter, who tracks some of what's going on in D.C. And he said this past weekend in D.C., the average 911 call was answered in 48 seconds, which is a very long time for a 911 call to be ringing. 48 seconds of the ringing going on. The national benchmark is 15 seconds to be able to answer the phone. 447 callers hung up after waiting more than 15 seconds. So you're talking hundreds upon hundreds of 911 calls that don't even reach a dispatch because people get tired of waiting for the ringing to end.
Right. I mean, you have jurisdictions like New Orleans, for example, where the average response time for the police when they send out a car is over 3 hours.
So what's the
so
point?
We've had,
I mean, if it's an emergency, what's the point of waiting 3 hours?
right. And so what happens is a lot of people give up on reporting. If you just make it more costly for people to report, you're going to have fewer people do it. And another issue is we've had lots of these Soros DAs who are downgrading crimes. So Alvin Bragg, who's been in the news a lot recently, he's downgraded the charges on 60% of his cases, with almost all of those being downgraded from felonies to misdemeanors. And the biggest area that he's doing that is with regard to assault. So aggravated assaults typically involve a weapon, a gun or something, but he's refusing to prosecute criminals for the use of a gun in a crime. And so what would have been an aggravated assault gets downgraded in the FBI data to a simple assault, a misdemeanor, which isn't in the official FBI violent crime data. Whereas with the National Crime Victimization data, they'll go and ask you about 40 questions about the crime, where it occurred, when it occurred, the characteristics of the criminal, whether you were harmed, how you responded, what the final outcome was. And then they'll ask you whether you reported the crime or not. And the thing is, with the national crime data, you'll say the guy had a gun. And so the national crime victimization data will record that as a violent crime in terms of aggravated assault, even though the district attorney, in terms of the official count, would have downgraded it from an aggravated assault, which the FBI would normally count, down to a simple assault.
So what we're witnessing is the data are being rigged in order to leave us with an impression that crime is down when, in fact, it's actually up.
Well, it's being rigged to some extent at the local levels, yeah. But there's lots of other problems that are occurring. Just the fact that we have fewer police, the police that are there don't have the experience because we've had large numbers of retirements. We're not getting responses. People don't understand that simply calling up 911 doesn't result in the crime being officially reported. there are lots of issues like that.
So can you address homicide specifically? One of the things I've seen CNN's coverage this week of this particular saga is they claim that murders have fallen 26.4% for the first quarter of the year compared to the same quarter last year. On what are they relying to establish that? And is it true? Is it true that fewer people are being killed by homicide?
Right. Well, look, of all the measures of crime that we have, the homicide measures over time tend to be best. These are very preliminary numbers. It's going to be a year over which these jurisdictions can correct it. And as you've pointed out earlier, we may have a third of these police departments, and many of the largest ones in 2022, for example, New York City and Los Angeles, police departments weren't reporting the data. So, it's preliminary numbers. I wouldn't be surprised, as often happens with these estimates, that the initial ones are moved up over time. And they're having to guess what the numbers are for a large number of jurisdictions that are there. So, but, in terms of reporting the crime, we don't have the same problem with homicides as we have with regard to other violent crimes. But, I'm going to put more weight on it a year from now than I'm going to put on the initial quarterly data that we have.
Got it.
And one thing I will say, and this kind of gets back to something we were saying before, when they say, well, decide whether to send out police officers to the scene, if it's a murder, they'll send out somebody all the time. And so what resources they do have for policing will be concentrated on the most serious crime, particularly if it's in progress at the time. And so if any crimes are going to be solved, if any crimes are going to be dealt with, it's going to be murder. The ones that are just completely ignored now are things like property crimes. And then you have things like aggravated assaults, which, are down the list.
Yeah, but even the murders now, they feel like they're up for grabs. I mean, what was that story from a week ago now of a woman? She carjacks a vehicle right here in Washington, D.C., outside of a hospital. There's an elderly woman in the car. She crashes the vehicle into the U.S. Attorney's office, literally into the U.S. Attorney's office. The woman in the vehicle dies. No murder charges for the carjacker. So it's just, even murders, they feel like they're a bit of a jump ball these days.
It's crazy, some of the stuff that goes on. I'll give you one example. About a week or so ago, there was a case in New York City, in Queens, where two 20-year-olds had gone into a wine store, were trying to steal bottles of wine. The store owner there kicked them out. One of them came back, started hitting and kicking one of the employees there, left, came back, again started kicking and hitting the employee and the store owner, Francisco Valerio. At that point, Valerio shot the attacker there, wounding him. He survived. But the district attorney there charged Valerio with attempted murder. He's facing up to 7 years in prison. Whereas the individual who was doing the assault didn't even get charged with assault. Only thing he's being charged with is petty theft. So while Valerio faces, who used a gun, as far as I can see, and was on the video, there's a video of it, in perfectly reasonable defensive gun use, the person who did the assault didn't even get charged with any type of assault.
Insane. The DA should be charged with something in that case. Thank you very much. John Lott, really appreciate your wise assessment of all of this data, as always, sir. Good to talk to you today.
Thanks. People can find more at our website at crimeresearch.org on all this stuff.
That's the place I go, crimeresearch.org. Thank you, John.